Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Steven Berkoff's play Agamemnon, which is an adaptation from the Aeschylus play that begins the Oresteia. Berkoff's version is very 1970s. And I say that in the sense of, like, in the late 60s and the 70s, a particular performance culture developed, which was very interested in ritual, was very interested in this sort of physicality of performance, was very interested in weird for weird's sake in some cases. And for me, Berkoff's Agamemnon falls directly into that tradition. It's also very concerned with some very 1970s themes, and we'll come back to those in a little bit. But we've got elements of this sort of very distinct, like, ritualized performance where things are done in some cases very oddly. We've got this section here, the arrival of Agamemnon, which is, it's, as a section, it's just labeled Agamemnon. And the stage directions here say, "We hear him arrive, a troop of horses," the chorus in elongated horse masks and shod feet, close parentheses, begins very slowly, like the herald, close parentheses, and grows faster and faster. The horses group tightly and expand, much as a film of horses seen in the distance, close parentheses. They canter and they gallop. As they tire, some horses drop out or collapse from exhaustion. It continues and the sound grows louder. It is the sound of the word Agamemnon, repeated and broken and hurled into the air like thunder. 10 years and at last he is here. The entrance should suggest this. Music and drums, brass instruments screaming, it still goes on. Chorus members may die in this enactment and must not take part unless they have strong hearts. In order to reach the town, they whip and beat each other. At last they slow down, allowing, naturally, Agamemnon to take the lead. They slow down to a slow motion and deliberately stately entrance. We see that Agamemnon has a captive tied to a rope which is around her neck. This is Cassandra. To make more of his return, it would be wise to let Agamemnon in prior scenes be played by a surrogate or memory. So, we've got this weird bit where the chorus is playing a group of horses and they're, like, charging around in this, like, film scene type way, and it feels to me like this very, like, ritualized performance. And I'm thinking here of people like Richard Schechner, who incorporated a lot of religious rituals and ceremonies and performance elements like this into these very sort of experimental avant-garde type plays. And that's kind of the feeling that I'm getting here. We also have a deep concern for the interconnections of sex and violence, which again seems to me like a very 70s preoccupation. In this section called Battle 1, the chorus describes... so we see Paris, who never actually appears in Agamemnon's play, but we see Paris and Helen, and the chorus describes their sex. It says there's two chorus bits here, which is weird because they're not, like, broken per se. So the first section, we saw her being pinioned by his thrusting strokes, exchanging sweat and stink with tattoos of their nightly games. The Trojan boy who kidnapped her will be paid with thrust for thrust, exchange cold steel for rape-hard flesh. Steel does not wilt, insatiate weapon, paying interest in its piercing blessings. Hard lovers of Argos. 10,000 men, 10,000 times will Trojan bellies open up to them. Then we have another section marked chorus, which is javelin, arrow, spear, sword, axe, cut, thrust, tear, bleed, hack. And I think that I'm almost certainly not inflecting that with enough sort of ritual chanting type thing. But this sort of interconnection of sex and violence, and this idea of like violence and sexuality, violence as a form of sexuality, sexuality as a form of violence, seems to me to be a very 1970s preoccupation, particularly among the artistic avant-garde. And again, we've got that sort of ritual chanting type section here. Javelin, arrow, spear, sword, axe, cut, thrust, tear, bleed, hack. Again, if we read this as a kind of chant, we have that, again, almost Richard Schechner type approach of like stripping down theater to its ostensible ritual basis. A couple of other things that are interesting in Berkoff's play. The opening section, which is something we don't really get in Aeschylus Agamemnon, is the legend is the section called Legend of Curse, and it's this long monologue spoken by the chorus about the source of the curse on the house of Atreus, because Atreus, basically what Atreus did is murder. So he murdered the children of his rival, okay. So Atreus is the grandfather of Agamemnon and Menelaus. Aegisthus is the grandson of his rival. Atreus murdered the children of his rival, baked them, and served them to his rival, whose name I can't remember, and I forgot to look it up, as a meal. And so that moment, that sort of desecration, became the origin of the curse on the house of Atreus, which includes the events of the Oresteia, in which Agamemnon is murdered by Clytemnestra. Clytemnestra is murdered by Orestes. Electra and Orestes sort of suffer the death of their father. Orestes is exiled. Electra is sort of kept captive, sort of, in the palace. And then Orestes is pursued by the Furies for matricide. So all of this falls under the curse of the house of Atreus. And so we get this lengthy, very just visceral description from the perspective of Atreus's rival, who's tricked into eating his children. And so it's very much more graphic than almost anything that we get in Greek tragedy. And it, in its like visceral bodily experience, is very, very striking. The other thing that's very 70s about this play is a preoccupation with contemporary or near contemporary events. So the earliest version of this play. They started working on it in 1973, and it premiered in 76 as a work in progress. No, okay, sorry. The full version was performed in 76. So there's a big concern actually with the Vietnam War. And when the herald comes to deliver the news that Troy has fallen and the Greeks have been successful, there's a number of references that he makes that would be Vietnam era rather than from the Greek heroic age. So he talks about napalm, he talks about howitzers, dum-dum shells. Zeus unleashed missile after missile and anti-missile, missile. Bazookas, patent tanks like Trojan horses. So we've got all of these references, Tommy guns, trenches, cannons, mortars, references that would be familiar to those in the era immediately following Vietnam. We've also got this interesting passage of Agamemnon toward the end, right before he's murdered by Clytemnestra. He says, "I'm so tired now. Suddenly I feel as if I can no longer hear the words you say. The years I spent away crowd my head with noise and music of the cries and clash of weapons, till I no longer hear even my own thoughts. What did you say to me? What do you mean? I thought I heard you ask me to say something to you, some soft words about our ancient bedtimes. I'd like to say something, but when I try to think, a memory comes swimming in my head and tears away the fragile pictures I retain of you. What did you say? Do you expect something? Your eyes look as if they expect something. They look empty, dried up, like you expect something from me. That will bring them to life again. Dried up pools, scoured dry with bitterness. I know you want a word or two from me that will bring back flooding back into those withered circles, tears, life, memories. But as I try to frame a word or two for you, the other sounds come rushing back again like sirens in my mind, as if to flood forever the distant empty years we had. The sounds we made are small. I'm so tired now. Prepare a bath for me, and perhaps then I'll find a word or two." So in this passage, we have Agamemnon as PTSD sufferer, as someone who is psychologically scarred by the violence that he's seen. And of course, this was a major concern in the late 70s, late 60s into the 70s, because you had so many soldiers coming back from the Vietnam War who were psychologically damaged by that experience. And Berkoff is capturing that experience in a very subtle, minimal way within this version.